Hey, it's Mrs. Gregg. Today I'm talking about water pollution. Specifically, I'm looking at the first module in Chapter 14. You need to be familiar with the case study that opens up Chapter 14. It's about Chesapeake Bay, which is the largest estuary in the United States. It's right near Virginia and Maryland, and at one time it was the most productive. Lots of good fishing, oysters there. But because of human-caused pollution, it's no longer the most productive. But we are working on remediating that and restoring that watershed so that we can try to get it back to where it was. It'll never be exactly how it was before people became involved, but we're trying to get it restored. Anyway, that watershed, it drains Maryland, Virginia, on up into Pennsylvania, New York, and there's a lot of agricultural land there, so lots of nutrients as far as fertilizer, phosphates, nitrates that have gone into the water. Also sedimentation as a result of land use changes. And so you can see in the picture there, you see the cloudy water as a result of sedimentation. This is a satellite view. Sedimentation choked out the natural grasses that grew underneath the water, and they would photosynthesize and help to keep dissolved oxygen levels up. Also, that sedimentation choked out, suffocated a lot of the organisms that were bottom dwellers. And then with the excess nutrients, we ended up with algae blooms that made and also caused problems with dissolved oxygen levels, as that algae tended to die off, and then the microbes used up the dissolved oxygen in the water in order to break down that dead algae. There's also issues with pesticides as a result of agricultural runoff, and then there are pharmaceuticals in the water too. Also from livestock, from agricultural runoff, we end up with pharmaceuticals, hormones. Lots of things are excreted in the urine of animals that ends up in the water. And also any types of pharmaceuticals that we take, say hormones, even like Tylenol or caffeine. You drink a cup of coffee, a little bit of that comes out in your urine and it ends up in the water. The water treatment plant can effectively remove all of those pharmaceuticals, and so they'll end up in the water. And we had a problem with Chesapeake Bay where some of the fish were affected as far as their sexual development. So, for instance, there were male fish who were making eggs as a result of those extra hormones that were in the water. But be familiar with that case with the Chesapeake Bay and the fact that we are working on remediating that and restoring that body of water today. Two big things as far as water pollution. You need to be familiar with what a point source is. That's where we can identify exactly the source of pollution. So, for instance, a discharge pipe from a factory would count as a point source. Non-point sources are a little bit harder to identify. So there you may have runoff that comes from a number of farms, or you could have runoff that comes from a large urban area. And it makes it difficult to identify exactly the sources, so we call that a non-point source. Very diffuse. Be familiar with, we have 4 different sources and types of water pollution. Be familiar with all of those. Wastewater is anything that comes as a result of livestock operations or human activities where we're dumping waste into the water. It also goes into gray water that we've talked about before. Remember, as a result of washing dishes or bathing or even washing a car could count as gray water. In some cases, we have arid regions that reuse that gray water. As long as it's not for drinking purposes, it's fine as long as it's cleaned up a little bit to spray on the lawn or to keep washing cars with, that type of thing. But gray water also falls into that category of wastewater. And then the problems with wastewater, as we're releasing wastewater into the environment, is it puts a demand as far as the dissolved oxygen levels. So there are bacteria, recall, that will break down waste when they're put into the water. And whenever they're breaking down that waste, they're actually doing cellular respiration. And that act of cellular respiration, they're going to be using up the dissolved oxygen in the water. Also, as bacteria are breaking down the waste that are in that water, that's freeing up and releasing the nutrients, primarily things like nitrogen and phosphorus. And if we start adding too much nitrogen and phosphorus, we start having issues with eutrophication. Last thing, we can have disease-causing organisms. Any kind of human or livestock waste has the potential for all types of bacteria, viruses, other different types of pathogens that can be shed in the waste, and it ends up in the water and it can cause issues there. As far as oxygen demand, we have a term called the biochemical oxygen demand, and that deals with microbes. Remember that whenever they're breaking down waste, they're using up oxygen out of the water. So whenever you examine water and you're measuring the biochemical oxygen demand, if you have a lower value, that means that there's less waste in the water, and that means that we have a better water quality. If you have higher BOD values, that means that the water's polluted and that you're not going to have good water quality. These microbes are having to do a lot of breaking down of that waste and are using up the oxygen out of the water. If we have too high of a BOD and the microbes are really having to break down a lot of stuff, we can end up potentially with dead zones where the bacteria have used up all of the oxygen in certain sections of the water. An example of a huge recurring dead zone is in the Gulf of Mexico. And so the Mississippi River, it drains about 40% of the continental United States. And remember, there are lots of farms through here. So we're having heavy nitrogen and phosphorus inputs into the Mississippi River. And all of those nutrients end up down in the Gulf of Mexico where the Mississippi dumps out. And so every summer, we end up with regions where the oxygen levels are depleted because of that heavy nutrient load, and the microbes are breaking down those nutrients and using those nutrients. We end up also with algae and overgrowth of algae in the water, and as those algae as they become too populated and they end up dying off, they put a demand on those bacteria and microbes to break down those dying algae. But every summer we end up with a dead zone, an area with really hypoxic area, depleted oxygen in the Gulf of Mexico due to all of that waste that comes down to the Mississippi. As far as dissolved oxygen, one of your activities is to look at the different water quality indicators. Dissolved oxygen is one of them. The higher the dissolved oxygen level, the better it is for the aquatic organisms. If you have really low levels of dissolved oxygen, then it makes it hard for things like fish to survive. You can look at the different types of organisms that live in the water. So some types of fish are fine, they do okay with lower DO levels. Some types of fish require really high oxygen levels. So sometimes you can look at the types of fish that live in the water and you can get an indicator right off the bat as to how good the water quality is, how much dissolved oxygen is. There is just based on the types of fish that live in the water. You need to be familiar with what we call the oxygen sag curve. So here we've got an issue of a point source pollution, where a company is discharging something into the water, and immediately where that point source discharges into the water, we're going to see a high biological oxygen demand, a high biochemical oxygen demand as the microbes start breaking down that waste. So also you're going to see that the dissolved oxygen levels start to sag in that area where the microbes are breaking down the waste. As you keep going down the river, as that waste flows down the river and the microbes break down that waste, you'll see dissolved oxygen levels start to recover. Not only because the microbes are breaking down the waste, but we're also seeing a dilution of the waste with the rest of the water in the river. So the dissolved oxygen levels will recover, and then we'll see that biochemical oxygen demand start to go down. More about the oxygen sag curve. Any stream is capable of recovering whenever you put organic waste into it, as long as you don't put too much. So just keep that in mind. If you overload a stream with too much biochemical oxygen demand, too much BOD, then you're going to end up having water quality issues. On to eutrophication. We've talked about that before. If you're putting too much nitrogen, too much phosphorus into a body of water, then the water is too rich in nutrients, and we can have issues with basically too many green things growing. Cultural eutrophication is a term that we use for anything that's anthropogenic. So whenever people have caused the eutrophication, namely because of agricultural runoff, too much fertilizer runs off into the body of water, and then also wastewater release. If we have improperly treated sewage or under treated sewage, or even whenever you're treating sewage, some companies, some sewage treatment plants are not taking out the nitrogen and phosphorus. That bleeds into what we call tertiary treatment, which is kind of optional treatment. then you can end up with too much nitrogen and phosphorus in the water and have cultural eutrophication. Be familiar with sources of cultural eutrophication. What are the effects of eutrophication? We've talked about this before. You can end up with basically too many green things growing in the water. You get an algae bloom. And then as those algae start to overpopulate, that increases the cloudiness or the turbidity of the water. So you aren't able to get in as much light as you could in the depths of the water. So those bottom-dwelling plants that ordinarily would be photosynthesizing and putting some oxygen back into the water, they start to suffer and they aren't able to photosynthesize as they should. So you start to see the dissolved oxygen levels decrease for one, just because of the turbidity, because of the cloudiness. And then for another, as those algae overpopulate and they start to die off, then the microbes that are in the water, as they are degrading the algae, as they're breaking them down, decomposing them, then they are using up what dissolved oxygen is left in the water. And so those DO levels will decrease. We can get regions of hypoxia, which means that we have low DO levels, so low sometimes, in fact, that we can end up with fish kills, where aquatic organisms are dying off because there is insufficient oxygen in the water. Be familiar with the different trophic states as far as bodies of water. We've talked about oligotrophic before. It means you have very few nutrients. The water is going to be clear, pristine. You have very low productivity. Lots of times you'll have few fish, but the water quality is going to be really good. You'll have high dissolved oxygen. You tend to have colder water, clear water. It's good quality water, but you have low primary productivity because you don't have as many nutrients in the water. So you may not have as much green stuff to support a food web in those oligotrophic lakes. Next you have mesotrophic. That would be the medium level. And then last is eutrophic. Most lakes that are in urban areas are going to be eutrophic due to runoff. And then you're going to see their poor water quality. There are disease-causing organisms. You need to be familiar with the different types of diseases that you can get as a result of pathogens that are in human waste or in livestock waste that ends up going into the water. So things like dysentery, stomach flu, diarrhea, cholera, typhoid, hepatitis, all of these can be caused by improperly treated wastewater that's disposed into waterways. We look at certain indicator species to tell the quality of the water. So I talked earlier about the fact that certain fish are tolerant of certain dissolved oxygen levels. So for instance, I think trout, they like clear, cold, oxygenated water. So if you have a stream where you see absolutely no trout, then probably the DO levels are not high enough to support that population. If you have, on the other hand, if you have a stream that's full of trout, then that's probably a really healthy stream. Sometimes you might hear in the news talking about fecal coliform bacteria levels being high around the Chattahoochee and some of its tributaries. That's because human waste has been released into those tributaries. Lots of times accidentally whenever we have floods, we end up with sewage spills that go into some of the tributaries of the Chattahoochee. So the fecal coliform bacteria themselves are not pathogenic. We all have a little E. coli in our digestive tracts, and that's just natural. And they're not harmful, but wherever you can find E. coli, this fecal coliform bacteria, it probably means that there are other bacteria that are naturally in people's digestive systems that can make you sick, that could show up with those. So we count the fecal coliform bacteria, we'll call those an indicator species, and that lets us know that there's human waste in the water, and there's a high likelihood of there being pathogenic stuff there as well. There are a couple of ways that we use to detect pollutants. One is chemical analysis. We can use that to look for dissolved oxygen levels, to look at the biochemical oxygen demand. We do that with a chemical analysis. You can look at nitrates, phosphates in the water. You can look at living organisms. So those indicator species, fish like trout, that's one example. You can look at all of the different types of insects that live in the water. and that'll give you an idea of how healthy the water is. Some insects do not tolerate pollution well at all. So if you don't find any of those insects, it means that you probably have poor water quality. The other thing is that we can use certain computer models that can be predictive of what's going on as far as bodies of water and how healthy it is. All right, so moving on, we need to look at septic systems. Chances are not a whole lot of you are on a septic tank because that's more in rural areas. There might be a few of you that are in an older house that may not have been connected to the sewer system. But with a septic system, what happens is you have a septic tank where all the waste, you flush the toilet or you're running the sink or taking a shower, all of that wastewater goes into the septic tank. And then in the septic tank, the waste is going to start to break down. You're going to settle out the solids, and you're going to end up with an effluent that will go out into the leach field. And then in the leach field, we have a pipe where that water will leach out into the leach field through those pipes. And then the microbes that are in the soil will help to break down what remains in that wastewater. Sludge in the septic tank itself, as the sewage goes into the septic tank, the solids are going to settle out. And so that sludge has to be pumped out of the septic tank every so often to make sure that you aren't overfilling the septic tank. You have to do that every 5 years or so and pump the sludge out. And that's what we're showing here. Let's see. The water that it's going to be pretty clear water that is left after the solids settle out into that septic tank, but it could still have pathogens. It's still going to have some organic waste in it. So as that water seeps out into the leach field, whatever harmful pathogens are there, they are most likely outcompeted by the microbes that are in the soil or the microbes that may have been in the septic tank. Also, whatever organic matter that's in there, it'll be broken down by the microbes that are in the leach field. And whenever that organic matter is broken down, we're going to be releasing CO2 and then putting more inorganic nutrients into the leach field, things like phosphorus and nitrates. Sometimes if you have, if the leach field is not operating properly, then you can have issues with waterlogged areas. That can happen when, for one, if your septic tank hasn't been pumped regularly. Also, for another, if you're having issues with drainage. Maybe the leach field has been used so much that we're having issues with drainage there. All right, on to what we probably know, we're all probably a little bit more familiar with, and that would be the sewage plant. So at home, whenever you flush the toilet, run the dishwasher, take a shower, run the sink, that wastewater goes down into the sewer system and it's carried off to our wastewater treatment plant, otherwise known as a sewage plant. And the goal there is to make sure that we're pulling out any kind of organic matter, any kind of solids, cleaning up that water before we release it back into the environment. Here's a picture of one of Cobb County's sewage treatment plants. This sits right off the Chattahoochee River. It's just inside the perimeter close to Smyrna. Okay, there are two overall main parts to sewage treatment. The first is primary treatment. That's where you are physically removing out the solids. And then the second part is secondary treatment, and that's a biological process where microbes are going to be degrading the organic matter and cleaning it up. Here's an overview of how a sewage treatment plant works. Make sure that you are familiar with all the parts there. You are doing the web quest. That should help you with that. Okay, so on to the different parts. Primary treatment is where you're physically separating out the solids. The first part comes, there's a metal grate, and that's taking out the big stuff. I once toured a sewage treatment plant, and they said that somehow a body, kind of gross, had gotten into the sewer system. And so the metal grating is going to get big things like that. Then it goes on to a bar screen. And so here's a picture of a bar screen. The bar screen is going to get any kind of maybe toilet paper that didn't break down, toys, strange things that kids flush down the toilet. That ends up being caught by the bar screen. Nowadays, one of the biggest things the bar screen gets is wipes. Even though like a Clorox wipe or maybe a baby wipe, even though it says that they are biodegradable, they're safe for flushing. They may not clog up the sewer system, but they will be caught by the bar screen. So the bar screen picks up tons of those flushable wipes every year. And then anything that's in the bar screen or maybe picked up by the metal grating, it's just going to be disposed of in a landfill. They'll cart that off to the landfill. Next thing, the water flows into a grit chamber. After we've separated out some of this big stuff, flows into a grit chamber, and that's where we're going to get out the little suspended solids like dirt. And then the next part is we go on to what we call the primary sedimentation tank. You might hear it called the primary clarifier or the primary settling tank. And there the water is going to settle, and we're going to lose about half of those organic solids. They're just going to settle out into the bottom. Here's an example of a primary clarifier. Here it is where it's empty. There's a bridge here, and then there's a scraper along the bottom. So a person can walk out here. That scraper runs along the bottom, and this arm moves slowly all the time. So here's an example whenever we've got it full of water. The solids are going to settle out along the bottom. The scraper comes along and scrapes the solids, sends them into a pit here where they can be collected. This flows out and they can be collected and carted off to a landfill. Secondary treatment is where we're going to be breaking down the waste that remains in the water. So this is a biological process. We have an aeration tank where we're going to pump it full of air. That's where the microbes are. They're going to be decomposing the waste. And then we have what we call a secondary clarifier where we're going to settle out whatever solids remain in the water. And then we'll be left with what we call effluent. And that effluent is going to be treated with chlorine, UV light, or ozone to kill any kind of harmful bacteria that might remain in the water. And then we can discharge that directly to a waterway. So here's an example of an aeration tank, also called an aerobic digester. So full of good microbes, full of good bacteria that are breaking down the waste, and then lots of air. One little thing, you don't want to fall in here. That water is so aerated that it makes it impossible for you to float. You sink right to the bottom. So you never want to fall in one of those. Here's a picture of the secondary clarifier. That again is where you're going to be settling out whatever solids remain after the microbes have cleaned up the water. And then the treated effluent, again, you treat it with some kind of disinfectant, so like chlorine, UV light, ozone. It's going to kill the harmful microbes, and then you can send this, discharge it directly into a body of water. And this happens to be one of our wastewater treatment plants is near Noonday Creek, and this goes directly into Noonday Creek. Some plants use what we call tertiary treatment. So back to the effluent here that we're putting out, it can still have nitrogen and phosphorus in it. Okay, so it's clean as far as there are not going to be any harmful pathogens in there, but we can still have nitrogen and phosphorus dissolved in it, which can cause problems with eutrophication. So what some larger municipalities have started doing is adding on tertiary treatment. And that tertiary treatment is going to chemically remove the nitrogen and the phosphorus from the water so that we can decrease the likelihood of having eutrophication issues. But that's optional. Not all places use this tertiary treatment. Recycled water is becoming popular in some arid areas where they're having issues as far as getting drinking water for people, too dry to get the drinking water. Here you take, some people call it toilet to tap. So you take the cleaned up wastewater and you put it directly into a water treatment facility to clean it up so that we can turn around and use it for drinking water. In that case, we're making it safe for drinking. We call that potable water if it's safe for drinking. Kind of, what goes on anyway, because if we use our wastewater as an example, once it's cleaned up and we're putting it into Noonday Creek, which will eventually make its way into the Chattahoochee, on down the Chattahoochee, somebody else is going to pull that water out of the Chattahoochee and clean it up for their drinking water. So kind of that same thing is going on anyway. We're just shortcutting it so we aren't returning that wastewater back to the environment. We're going to turn it around and use it directly to turn it into potable water so that we can drink it. Right now, places out in California, El Paso, Texas, Singapore, those places are using this toilet to tap technology. We can treat wastewater naturally. Now, not with necessarily harmful pathogens will it clean that up, but it can remove some of the organic and the inorganic pollutants. If you discharge wastewater, say, into a swampy area with plants that are designed that can tolerate that swampiness, things like cattails are good for cleaning up wastewater. They'll pull some of the nutrients out, pull some of those organics out, and clean it up. Manure lagoons, if we're talking about livestock operations, all of that manure can be sent into a lined lagoon. The liner is there to prevent issues with the wastewater seeping into the groundwater system and causing problems with the groundwater, polluting that. But the manure goes into these huge lagoons where bacteria will break down the manure and break down the pathogenic stuff that's in the manure, and then they can collect the solids and use that as fertilizer. There are issues sometimes whenever if you have flooding near an area, all of this stuff floods out and then it ends up contaminating people's yards and fields and so forth. All right, so that's it for this particular module. I know that was a lot. I didn't mean to bore you. It's 26 minutes. Anyway, I'll make you some separate videos for the rest of the modules in this unit. And hope you enjoyed it, and I will see you next time. Bye.